So, from the beginning, our republic restricts the franchise to males over the age of 21 who are of European stock or are manumitted slaves, and who are citizens and who have property. But this high standard of citizenship, which keeps a relatively small proportion of the resident population of the young United States voting, is going to quickly change. Frontiersmen who have log cabins and Kentucky rifles and who basically build everything that they use with their own hands begin to wonder about the democracy in restricting the vote to a bunch of wealthy people. And politicians, especially during the time of the Democratic-Republican Party, where there was only one party in this country, we're talking from the late 1820s through the 1840s, the era of Andrew Jackson. During that period, and a little bit before, politicians quickly realized that if we are seen to have spread the franchise, allowed more and more men to vote and achieve suffrage, they're going to think well of us, and we'll get more votes. And maybe our policies are the kind of policies that would appeal to small farmers on the frontier rather than rich bankers back east. So each state reduces systematically their property standard, as do the territories who become states early in the country's history as the Northwest territories are converted to American states. By 1850, most property requirements are gone. Most. The vast majority of them are. So you no longer have to be a propertied male, adult male of European stock who's a citizen. Now you can simply be an adult male of European stock or a manumitted slave who is a citizen. So, this is the standard as we approach the American Civil War. Any freeborn man, or freely a person who achieves freedom by their own efforts, man, can vote if he's over 21. So, when the Civil War is fought over the questions of whether states who had freely joined the Union can leave the Union, and whether slavery is to be permitted anywhere in these United States, when that war is fought and won by the Federalists, by the Union, after the war, things are going to change. Now, during the war, in his Emancipation Proclamation, Abraham Lincoln frees America's slaves in rebel territory. After the Emancipation Proclamation percolates through government, that expression of freeing the slaves is going to be expanded to include anywhere in the United States. So the slaves are free. They're no longer property by the end of the Civil War. But are they going to be sent back to Africa? Or are they going to be considered to be as American as apple pie and the daughters of the American Revolution, who are basically people who can trace their lineage back to anyone who fought in the American Revolution? If Africans who were enslaved wanted to return to Africa, and there were a lot of people who believed in returning the slaves to Africa after they had been freed. This movement, in fact, had been so big before the Civil War that abolitionist groups helped set up an African country that still exists. Before the Civil War, the nation of Liberia in West Africa, west of Ghana and east of the Atlantic Ocean, near where the chin of Africa sort of begins to go up. That's Liberia down here by the tip of the chin. Liberia, the nation of liberty, is established by American abolitionists and former American slaves who are freed and go back to Africa. The capital is Monrovia. named after James Monroe, who was President of the United States at the time of the founding of Liberia. The former American slaves become a new upper class in Liberia, and throughout most of its history, they rule over the natives that lived there as a colonial power would rule over a bunch of primitive natives in European colonies. So the former American slaves who go back to Liberia go back to Africa, but they have been civilized, for better or worse, and they lord it over the locals. So they don't enslave them, but they do treat them like second-class citizens in their own country, which is going to cause problems that plague Liberia to this day. In fact, when Lincoln becomes president, the question is what to do with freed slaves. And Lincoln, early in his presidency, was on the side of, well, if they're not from here, let's return them to their homes. Let's return them to Africa. Something changed his heart, and something changed his mind. And what it was bloody battle. Black soldiers had been recruited into the Union Army and, surprisingly, the Confederate Army. Black soldiers fought for Virginia and the other Confederate states because they were fighting for home, which is news to a lot of people who can't possibly imagine somebody who had been a slave fighting for a slave society. But that isn't the way they thought of it. The Confederates thought of themselves as fighting for their rights and fighting for the freedom of their state to be an independent country if the federal union no longer allowed it to make important decisions. But in the North, there were units of the Union Army that were recruited. They were segregated. There were black units commanded by white officers. But these units fought incredibly bravely. They fought in amazingly bloody battles. There is a movie that was made around 1990 called Glory, which I will try to link to one of the to an appendix video, a video of additional materials for this week's lessons. And I recommend that you see a clip or two, or that you see the entire movie. It's a movie. It fictionalizes and combines a lot of things, but in general terms, it does a good job of showing what one of the first black units in the Union Army did. And what they did is they took about 80% casualties and kept fighting, which is not something modern military units really do. Lincoln changed his mind. The sacrifice of these black soldiers changed his mind. They had fought to be Americans. They had fought to be citizens of the United States. So by the time of the end of the Civil War, Lincoln and many Republicans believed in reforming society so that blacks would achieve citizenship. Former slaves would get the right to vote. And in 1868, they passed the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, which, as you know, grants slaves the right to vote. Which, as you know, grants former slaves, the right to vote. Former slaves who are male and over the age of 21. Now, the period between 1865 and roughly 1872, maybe 1868 in some places, is the period immediately after the Civil War, and it's called Reconstruction. It's the time when radical Republicans, who were the party of freeing the slaves, went south and tried remaking Southern society along their idealistic lines. So in the period of Reconstruction, the 5 or 7 years after the defeat of the Confederacy in the Civil War, Northerners who came south, who were called carpetbaggers because they had all their stuff rolled up in basically a blanket that looked like a carpet bag, became the politicians and leaders and lawyers, and they got several black candidates elected to office, elected to the U.S. Congress, for example. So how is it that in the 1860s we have African American candidates who run for Congress and win with black votes, and then 20 years later you have a set of Jim Crow laws that prevent blacks from voting in any significant numbers? Well, the reason is, immediately after the Civil War, the southern states were occupied territory of a defeated nation. And they were run by the American Army, and they were run by northern politicians. But by the middle of the 1870s, the Southerners had been granted their freedom back. And this meant that the Southern whites who had owned slaves before the war were Southern whites who ran big farms and had a lot of black sharecroppers after the war. The black sharecroppers were free, but they were poor, and they didn't have an education, and they didn't really understand the system, and the laws were changed. If you had one African American grandparent, you were considered to be legally black, and you had restrictions on the freedoms that you could exercise. And it was all written very subtly and very finely so that it didn't seem unconstitutional if you didn't really look closely at it. So the 14th Amendment gives former male slaves the right to vote, but in fact, with the exception of a brief period right after the Civil War, those rights are going to have to be deferred. You're going to have to wait another 100 years. More next lecture.